Hey there everyone, welcome to yet another tutorial, and welcome to my new class, which is Print Layout and Design. In this class we're going to be looking at how to lay out particularly news articles, but we're also going to be looking at the principles of print design and specifically how to work with Adobe InDesign. So you'll see on my screen right here, I have InDesign open. I'm running, I believe, the newest version for 2020. And this is a similar screen to what you will be greeted with when you first boot up Adobe. The only difference will be that I have all sorts of previous saved projects filling the middle of the screen. You won't have those. But let's walk through the basics of InDesign. In this class, in this specific tutorial, we're just going to be looking over what InDesign is, most of the functionalities of all the buttons in your workflows. And then once we get into the next tutorial, we'll start looking at things like laying out script and then images in the tutorial after that. So without further ado, I'm just going to click on Create New over here on the right side of the screen, left side of the screen. So with that, I get a pop-up. There we go. There's all sorts of things we can do here. We can adjust the width, height, the different units we're using to measure our layouts. We can add a specific number of columns, bleed, and slug, which isn't really something relevant to us in our class. There's also all sorts of pre-made designs and templates for different sizes of paper, for different options on the web, for different mobile layouts. In our case, right now, just for this example, I'm going to open up an A4 under print, which is 210 millimeters by 297 millimeters and is a portrait orientation. There's nothing I'm going to change on this for now because again, I'm just booting up a basic layout. This is also where we have the option, first and foremost, to name our project. I'm just going to call this Practice. From there, let's click on Create. Okay, so this is your bread and butter. This is where you'll be doing 99% of the things you do on InDesign in this screen here. The thing is, like any other Adobe program I've taught you or anyone else may have taught you, there's all sorts of different ways to lay out this program. And so I'm going to suggest that you go to the top of your screen on the right-hand side, and up where mine currently says Essentials Classic, we're going to click on that and go to Typography. Again, you can work in whatever format you want to work in. This is what I'm going to be teaching in from now until the end of the class. This has pretty much all the tools you'll need to lay out a news article. Or even, for that matter, design the posters, which will be your first assignment, which we'll touch on a little later. So, with that, we're just going to go over the workspace under Typography. So, to start, much like any other Adobe programs, we have all sorts of tools on the left-hand side. We have our selection tool and our direct selection tool. This basically, in a nutshell, selection allows us to grab things. Direct selection allows us to grab specific parts of things. We'll see that in the next tutorial. After that, let's see, we got the page tool, the gap tool, content collector, content placer. Not really relevant to you in any work you'll be doing for me for this class. After that, we have the type tool, which lets us put in, I'm not seeing, I changed tools. There we go. So the type tool allows us to type in text. You'll recognize it by a T for an icon. After that, we have the line tool, which, surprise, surprise, lets us draw lines. And we can adjust our settings after that fact. Then we have the pen tool, which lets us draw different shapes and work with the shapes of various objects. We have the pencil tool, which is pretty much a freehand version of the pen tool. After that, we have what I would argue is the most important tool you're going to see on this toolbar, that is your rectangle frame tool. And all that does is draw rectangles all over our screen. While we're on the subject, I'm just going to clear my screen. You'll hear me say it multiple times. Adobe InDesign is basically just the practice of drawing a bunch of rectangles and making them look pretty. The cool thing about this tool is that when you draw these rectangles and switch out of your working mode, you don't see them anymore. They're invisible frames. Speaking of seeing our rectangles, let me get rid of a couple. We then have our rectangle tool, which is a shape tool. If you click and hold it, you can draw different shapes. Same with the frame tools. But this is the kind of rectangle where we can draw. Oh, I filled that guy in, but still. With the rectangle tool, we can draw shapes that actually do appear when we draw them. So in this case, let me just throw some color on there. Any rectangle I draw has the color settings that I've set below, which we'll talk about in a second. Next up, we have the scissors tool, which is occasionally useful for cutting lines into smaller lines. We have the rotate tool. We have gradients, swatches, and feathers. We have an option for notes, color themes. The hand tool allows us to drag our workflow around to see different components, especially when we're really zoomed in. Zooming back out. Speaking of zoom, we then have our zoom tool, which I don't recommend using. It takes a lot of time to go click on the tool and zoom in or zoom out. For those of you at home, when I'm zooming it in and out here, I'm just holding Control plus or minus. And if I want to see the entirety of my project, Control 0. This is way quicker than using the tool, so I recommend you get used to doing that. Below that, we have our color options. Anyone who's worked in Photoshop will recognize this kind of layout. The first is our fill, which will be the insides of any shapes we create. The second is our stroke. Stroke is another way to say outline. That will affect the outline of our shapes. Moving on, let's move up to the top bar. The top bar has a lot of cool different functions, and it really, well, here, text. There we go. The top bar changes depending on what we've clicked on. So if I have an object selected, I have settings like position, size, so position, size. We've got scale, we've got rotation, we've got skew, all sorts of different tools to move things around. We have our color settings up here, so I can change my colors. We have stroke settings, which go beside that. Lets me increase or decrease or just adjust the stroke of my objects. We have all sorts of other little functions in here. If you hover over them, it will tell you what they do. We have things like word wrap, which I'll be talking about in next tutorial or the one after. The cool thing about the top bar is that if I have, let's say, my text highlighted, suddenly all those options turn to text options. Things like what font I'm using, whether I want it in caps or small caps, different width and kerning and tracking settings, which we'll talk about probably in class, as well as paragraph options on the far side. So center alignment, justify, etc. Again, we'll talk about these in class. Finally, on the far side, we have all sorts of options going down the side of the screen. These are different tool menus, basically. Some of them are super relevant, and some of them aren't so relevant to your work. So let's just go through them. First, we have pages. Pages lets us see the various pages of our layout. In this case, we only have one. In the case of our newspaper, we have at least 8 pages. We have several pages. You probably won't need to make use of this too much. Same with the layers. The only time you'll need to make use of layers is if something is set behind something else and you want to adjust that. You can drag that item to the top of the layers and it will appear on top. Again, anyone who's worked with pretty much any Adobe program is used to the idea of what layers go where. Let's see, we've got swatches and CC libraries, nothing really relevant to you. Swatches are our colors, so we can change colors up. It will be relevant to your poster design, won't so much be relevant to your newspaper layout. Glyphs is adding symbols. Word wrap or text wrap shapes words around an image. So if I were to put 2 paragraphs around the square or rectangle and then add text wrap to it, the text would work its way around the rectangle. We have more stroke options, a bit more complex than when we just click on something. We have gradient options, which allow us to apply a gradient to an object. We have alignment, which is one of my favorite tools because I am a perfectionist when it comes to this kind of stuff. Alignment lets us line things up, all on one side, along the center of the objects. It allows us to distribute properly. Really useful when you're designing from scratch. Then we have Pathfinder, which basically allows us to take multiple objects and divide them, separate them, turn them into one whole object. There's all sorts of different things we can do with Pathfinder. But again, nothing really relevant to your immediate assignments. If you want to know more, feel free to ask me during class, in an email, whatever. This kind of stuff's my jam. I'm more than happy to talk about it. After that, we have story, hyperlinks, and effects. Again, not particularly relevant. Effects is where you can apply effects to specific images, text, etc. Let's give them all a drop shadow, for example. When we click on an effect, we get all sorts of options. I'm just going to hit OK. And now everything has a drop shadow. 4 particularly relevant tools to you guys, which I'll be talking about in depth in next assignment or next tutorial, is the paragraph tab, which gives us all sorts of paragraph options. The paragraph styles tab, which allows us to make templates for different styles of paragraph that we use in our designs. That way we don't have to keep reapplying all the settings. We can just click on a style and go with it. You'll see what I mean next tutorial. Then we have character settings and character styles. Same exact thing, but instead of affecting whole paragraphs, like alignment and line spacing and all of that, this can affect a single word. So with text highlighted, let's just make that guy bigger before anything else. There we go. So I can adjust things like its size or its font. I can change things like its height, which isn't super apparent here, but if I were to set it to something like 500, that was me setting the width. All of these different tools and settings are super important within the work you're going to be doing for your posters, for your layouts, for anything else you may do on this program. And that's, let me double check, but that's about it for the overview of these different tools. The only other things to remember are that in a layout, the W key is your best friend. When you don't have typing going on, hitting W shows you things like margins. It shows you the lines that text falls on. It shows you all the different frames that exist in a layout. In fact, let me pull open a little layout I've been working on for our tutorial. This is what we're going to be working on next tutorial. But when I hit W, you can see all the specific squares that make up my text layout. You can see some of the circles that make up my my cover photo. So this allows you to really get into the nitty-gritty and make sure everything's aligned, everything's looking good, everything's working out how you want it to, or more importantly, how your editor wants it to. But yeah, I'm referring to my notes. Looking at my notes, that's about it for now. So again, in a nutshell, we have our tools on the left-hand side, which let us affect specific things on the screen by just clicking on them. We have a customizable top toolbar that really changes depending on whatever we've clicked on. And then we have our tool settings, different windows that let us affect different things on our format. So again, if you're confused as to what's going on here, you're not seeing the same things I'm seeing, well, just go up top and where it says Essentials, Essential Classic, Book, I'm not sure, make sure it's on typography. And that should get you the same view that I'm looking at right now. So with that, I hope you guys have been following along, and I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks very much.